More often than most great writers, Nietzsche has been seen in the perspective of his relation to some specific man or movement. At one time it was evolutionism, at another Nazism, and after the defeat of Hitler, existentialism. But no one approach of this kind is at all adequate to bring out that experience of the world on which Nietzsche's philosophy was based. To that end, it would be more fruitful to juxtapose Nietzsche with a great poet. And in the next two chapters, that's what he intends to do. This book's been really, really an enlightening read. I love it because it tackles such a broad range of thinkers, from Goethe, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Rilke, Freud, and that's as far as I've gotten so far in this book. These last couple chapters here, this book is putting Nietzsche, who of course you all know I'm a big fan of, into a broader context of all the greatest thinkers of the last 1,000 years. And one of the big themes of, well, history, especially the one that this book conveys, and also that this book conveys, is the irrefutable influence, profound influence that Christianity has had on Western civilization. And Nietzsche was one of the first people to ask new questions and bring that into light and try to dig underneath the kind of veil of Christian spirituality that had been softly settling on top of all endeavors of thinking of the last 2,000 years prior. And this book here is at least in a couple of chapters here is trying to understand the difference between art, truth, and tradition, philosophy versus poetry. These are some of the chapter names here. And I thought I would try to gloss over some of the things that I've gleaned. I've been using that word a lot. Off of these two books. This is Walter Kaufmann's book, From Shakespeare to Existentialism. And I have Jordan Peterson's book, which you can see the dust jacket for over my shoulder. I think for me and pretty much anything I try to convey to you guys on this channel, for me is the fact that I understand things much better when I have a scaffold or a framework to put them in. And with Nietzsche, when you have the proper historical context, his ideas start to be a lot more clear, make sense. And for instance, Nietzsche's ideas about ethics. Let's read this here. Nietzsche's ideas about ethics are far less well known than some of his striking coinages. Immoralist, overman, master morality, slave morality, beyond good and evil, will to power, immoralist, overman, master morality, slave morality, beyond good and evil. Will to power, re-evaluation of all values, and philosophizing with a hammer. These are indeed among his key conceptions, but they can be understood correctly only in context. This is true of philosophic terms generally. Plato's ideas or forms, Spinoza's God, Berkeley's ideas, Kant's intuition, all do not mean what they would mean in a non-philosophic context, but scarcely anybody supposes that they do. In Nietzsche's case, however, this mistake is a commonplace, surely because few other philosophers, if any, have equaled the brilliance and suggestiveness of his formulations. So, an attempt will be made in this chapter to sketch the context from which Nietzsche's central conceptions derive their meaning. And the first thing I have here is that Nietzsche derived, he revolutionized ethics by asking new questions. With Nietzsche, ethics becomes a critique of culture, a vivisection of modern man. Because our moral philosophers knew the facts of morality only very approximately, in arbitrary extracts or in accidental epitomes, or epitomes, maybe. They were poorly informed and not even very curious about different peoples, ages, and the past. They never laid eyes on the real problems of morality. what were these new questions that Nietzsche asked? His last little critique was that only what the philosophers called a rational foundation for morality and tried to supply was properly considered only a scholarly variation of a common faith in the prevalent morality. So, Nietzsche's big critique was that all these great philosophers like Kant and Hume and disclaimer, I don't know a whole lot about philosophy, so this is an interpretation of what I've read, not claiming for it to be true, and it might not be, but from what I understand is that Nietzsche was one of the first guys to ask about the origins of our morality, and instead of Hume or Kant, who supposed that the morality that existed was just irrefutably correct and unquestionably good. And Kant and Hume to Nietzsche simply were justifying in an extremely articulate and rational manner, philosophically sound, a logically sound, rigorous manner. They were simply justifying what they already felt to be true and as the ultimate absolute morality. Whereas Nietzsche wanted to question whether the current prevailing morality that Christianity had bestowed upon us over 2,000 years was in fact justified. And in order to answer that question, he had to dig deeper into our past. So I'm going to read a reference, some things out of the 12 Rules for Life. Even when the modern atheists opposed to Christianity belittle fundamentalists for insisting, for example, that the creation account of Genesis is objectively true, they're using their sense of truth, which has been highly developed over centuries of Christian culture, to engage in such argumentation. Carl Jung continued to develop Nietzsche's arguments decades later, pointing out that Europe awoke during the Enlightenment as if from a Christian dream, noticing that everything it had heretofore taken for granted could and should be questioned. The central dogmas of the Western faith were no longer credible, according to Nietzsche. Nietzsche also believed that Paul, and later the Protestants following Luther, had removed moral responsibility from Christ's followers. They had watered down the idea of the imitation of Christ. This is a particularly captivating example of, this is just the stuff that really, really fascinates me about digging into our past and our histories, because Christianity was supposed to be about imitating Christ. And when you think, and when you start to believe instead that Christ was simply a scapegoat for our sins, and that we're accordingly therefore enabled to live as sinful of a life as we want, as long as we accept Christ at the end of it, it postpones the responsibility of living a life like Christ in the present. In an excerpt from Beyond Good and Evil by Nietzsche, The Long Bondage of the Spirit, he says, the persistent spiritual will to interpret everything that happened according to a Christian scheme, and in every occurrence to rediscover and justify the Christian God in every accident. My voice is a little raspy, sorry. All this violence, arbitrariness, severity, dreadfulness, and unreasonableness has proved itself the disciplinary means whereby the European spirit has attained its strength in its remorseless curiosity and subtle mobility, granted also that much irrecoverable strength and spirit had to be stifled, suffocated, and spoiled in the process. So, the fascinating theory that Jordan Peterson always posits is that, I want to learn more about this, is that Christianity was so dogmatic and regimented and disciplined for thousands, well, at least, 1,500, 100 years or so, that it actually was the primary force in cultivating our scientific mindset to question everything and find the truth at all expense. And ironically, this relentless questioning and this discipline in which we came to cultivate our senses, to cultivate our reasoning, to be able to rationalize and see God in everything. Basically, our ability to see God in everything and have to really rack our brains to be able to try to formulate reasons God would want this arbitrariness and violence and severity and dreadfulness and unreasonableness by testing the limits of our capabilities to explain, we unwittingly were what were we doing? We were well, we were training our minds intellectually, and the more I suppose the central theme of Christianity was to speak the truth, and when this became something true believers could really hang on to and grip onto, they did so in such a radical manner that inevitably during the Enlightenment, or prior to the Enlightenment, during the Reformation, I guess, this led to questioning it, questioning everything, and ultimately Christianity itself fell under that scrutiny, and that was an eyeglass I was holding up. And when we started to, of course, question the most dogmatic elements, the most unquestioned and taken for granted elements of the Bible and biblical explanations under a scientific lens, this led to devastating critiques of Christianity, and skipping over volumes and volumes of debate, if we just assume, for the sake of argument, that Nietzsche was right in the sense that he said God was dead, because our appeal to spiritual authority, or even the spiritual essence of nature and our being, if that was stripped from us because of this bright scientific light that burned away all of our, well, maybe not burned away, but confused our perception of, made it hard to discern the difference between superstition and genuine spiritual insight, that feeling of awe you get. There's difference between superstition and an appeal to all the things that science can't tell us, which is a lot, and our our synthesizing of all those unknowns into a sense of awe and wonder about the universe that we had prior to the Enlightenment. was pervaded. Everything was imbued with a spiritual essence. Nature, very much like the Native Americans look at things. Trees, mountains, things we don't consider living in a scientific age. We lose depth of experience by writing those things off. And so Nietzsche, he says when we have to realize God is dead and we no longer have divine guidance on what to do with our lives, and we think that nothing has meaning any longer, Nietzsche thought that we would become very susceptible to new ideas, ultimately totalitarian, utopian ideas. And yeah, that actually directly ties into something in the other book here. We are so it's a kind of a paradox, because we innately want to believe in something higher and better than ourselves, and we appeal to poetic language and spiritual language, and that's why movies are so big. There's no factual truth in them, dryly and logically speaking, but nonetheless, that doesn't take away from the fact that we do feel something when we watch that. When we watch The Avengers or Lord of the Rings, we have a sense of awe. We can, in our mind, we feel like we like playing out that scenario, the fantasy. It's when we listen to a beautiful song, someone like Jim James from My Morning Jacket, when he sings. What is it about music that we are willing to pay so much for? That's the sense of awe and wonder and spirituality that science can't explain. I mean, ASMR is even an example of it, I guess, really. ASMR is, it's a very spiritual, deep feeling you get, I think. So, Carl Jung countered Nietzsche's argument that we need in the face of a lack of God, we need to come up with our own values. Nietzsche, for his part, posited that the individual human beings would have to invent their own values in the aftermath of God's death. But this is the element of his thinking that appears weakest psychologically. We cannot invent our own values, but because we cannot merely impose what we believe in our souls. And this was Carl Jung's great discovery. aside for a second and give me a second while I find this. I think it's in this chapter. This is a good example of just how much we need as individuals, and particularly enlighteningly as a society, by the way we act and the people we choose to represent us, that we need a spiritual guidance. And I have such a hard time wording it because I don't understand it myself, really. But we need to trust and allow for spirituality in life as much as we need the sober, as I tried to consolidate my thoughts, the sober reality and the sober practicality of reason. The popularity in post-war Germany, post-World War II, of Heidegger's attempts to gain a new standpoint in interpretations of Hölderlin's poetry almost makes one wonder whether large masses of people have become so used to bowing before madness and illogic, accepting the intuitions of a madman as authoritative revelations, that the demise of one such authority, Hitler, has sent them looking frantically like dope addicts to find another source. The recovery of sanity and humanity demands the disciplined repudiation of narcotics. Reason is needed, not the intoxication of the sometimes splendid madness of Nietzsche's prose. The great German philosophers Kant, Fichte, Hegel, and Nietzsche, no less than Leibniz, tried without exception to absorb the riches of the European Enlightenment, instead of simply rejecting it as shallow. And the great poets, emphatically including those of Germany, also point the way towards humanity. His point is that reason and spirituality are both things that we believe in, and reason works because of what you're watching me on, and spirituality is needed because without it we lose our sense of wonder and awe, and ultimately I think it adds to our meaning that we find in life. There's just so much we don't understand that it's hard to it's easy, I guess, to if you believe in science and are interested in science, it's easy, it was for me to get lost and overwhelmed by the sheer kind of the dryness of science sometimes. And I think I wrote science without passion and wonder is dead. And I think we're coming out of that now, and there's a huge dialectic over the centuries between spirituality and suppressing reason, not asking too many questions, appealing to authority as the ultimate answer to give meaning to your life, but also that withholds man's independence and our ability to create our own values. And I think the creation of values is a delicate matter. It can't be done in a small time. It has to unfold and be accepted and ripple, pervade through society, and that's the function of the masses and our need for communication and being on the same wavelength as masses, as society as a whole. We branch out into our own lives and our own heroic journeys, and we explore and create new ideas and values and perceptions and ways to live and look at life. But we always tap back in to the masses, and that's how we stay grounded. We always refer back to our baseline, which is, what does everybody else think? And does my view of life coexist harmoniously with that? And if not, are millions, billions of people wrong, or am I? Or is there a compromise we need to reach? And the other end of that vacillation is, or oscillation, is extreme, instead of spirituality, extreme reason, which can, as a pitfall, can destroy our sense, can crumble our sense of reality. If we had, I think it can be too dry, it can be too factual, it can be too presumptuous of its own, or pretentious of its own ability to understand the universe, because we do know a hell of a lot by reasoning, but there's also a lot we don't know and have tried to explain and can't yet. But I thought it was interesting that he wrote, it became an axiom that the Enlightenment had been ridiculously shallow. So we lose depth when we ironically have faith in science too much. We eventually have faith that science is going to solve everything, and we are the only ones who will be left to take the place of gods in power and understanding and technology. And I think that's a I don't know, when you get too arrogant when you drain the possibility of a spiritual and spiritual existence, I think you remove a lot of the depth that you could potentially tap into. And the last point I want to leave you guys, leave you all with, is Nietzsche's central concern was thus with man's humanity. Beginning with his early essays, the untimely meditations, he wanted to counter Darwin's doctrine of the continuity of man and beast with a new image of humanity that must be based on an empirical, a psychological foundation. Thus, he sought what in man might not only be an animal, that which might give man an exceptional position in the cosmos. He wanted to define what made us unique. Not gods, but not beasts. Right now, that tightrope, walking over the abyss between the two. Not brutal qualities, but those which differentiate man and elevate him. And he found man's artistic and man's philosophic efforts, but above all else, the gift of organizing the chaos of his passions and desires, the power to give style to one's own character. So he wanted to do justice to the irrational, but not by way of a cult feeling. Like, he wanted to do it psychologically. He wanted to understand us psychologically. So that's why he was a precursor to Jung and Freud and everybody else, Peterson. He wanted to understand all these things like emotions and feelings of passion that overwhelm us, and we can't rationalize them, at least yet. But nonetheless, like why do certain forms of music overwhelm us with passion and joy or anger or sadness? It's a beautiful, why do we see beauty, quality, like Zen in the art of motorcycle maintenance? How do we truly discern quality of art, especially? So I thought that was a fascinating point. Hope you did too. Sleep well.